Today's going to be a little bit more informal than usual. Part of that is just, time constraints in terms of me putting things together. It's also just a matter of, hey, we're going to spend more time in Android Studio than necessarily on the slides. And it's something actually I've been doing for several years now. This is something I've been doing for been teaching here for, as actually something I did at my job before I started here. So this is something I've got like almost 4 to 6 years of experience in this kind of thing. So this is something that will be a little bit more off the cuff. It's also worth mentioning that the documentation for a lot of this stuff isn't kind of in one place because there's a lot of different tools that you need to pull this off. Okay, so in general, when we're talking about localization, what we mean is getting your app from being just, say, English, just targeted at English and American speakers, targeting at people who speak other languages and live in different countries and have different, cultural differences. And so that includes not just language, but it also includes things like how do you format dates and how do you format numbers. And so there's a little bit more to it than just, hey, maybe I need to change it from English to Spanish, etc. So our overall goals today, we're going to talk about first, how to translate our apps into other languages. So specifically what I want you to do for the lab is to translate your app as a whole into Spanish. That's it, right? That's the phase, is take your app that you currently have and get it into Spanish. We're going to talk about a bunch of tools to make that happen, okay? And those tools I want you to employ. So we're going to talk about how to get into other languages. I'm going to actually throw this in here and probably do more than one language just to kind of demo that. We'll talk about how to format strings for use with different languages and cultures and a lot of the tools that we can use for the formatting part of that. We'll talk about how, and then we may, as we kind of work through this, you may find some places in your layout where you may need to update those as well. So we may be looking at doing some fixes to your layouts as well. I've been pretty careful in my project to try to use things like wrap content instead of fixed sizes. But I know some people have been using, sometimes fixed width and fixed heights. And so you may run into some issues there as well where you may need to go to wrap content. It's largely going to be the change. The other side of that things, a lot of this, making it adapt to different languages, a lot of this is also handled by using constraint layout. So if you're starting with some other kind of layout, there's more you might have to do with the layout, but because we've done constraint layout primarily for all of our layouts and things like that, there'll be a little bit less there because those already have some flex. Okay? So there's a lot of different pieces here are linked, relevant. They're not particularly in any great order, but if you were going to read through them, I would recommend reading through them in the order that's up there. There's also a single lesson in your textbook, which is related both to what I'm going to talk about today and what I'm going to talk about Monday. It's lesson 5.3. So if you are interested in seeing what's in the textbook, that's there. It is a little bit dated, and there's a little bit too much focus on adaptive layouts and not enough focus in translations, but it is there as an option. I would recommend more. That's going to be more relevant to what we talk on Monday than maybe what we talk about today, but that's where it is covered. All right, so kind of overview today. First I want to talk about the whys, right? So kind of talk about what localizing is, right? Localizing is getting it into other cultures, right? Getting into their standards. But why do I want to do that in the first place, right? Why would I want to translate my app into another language to start out with?
Well, I guess just to make it more accessible to other people and cultures, and
right.
If you don't, otherwise you're missing out on an entire market.
Potentially, yeah, I may be missing out on parts of the market if I don't translate it. There are a lot of apps and a lot of websites who do strictly put out their content in just English. Like that does happen. So it's a little bit more than just that. It's also making it, more friendly and more like it's theirs. right? You had a hand up?
Oh.
Okay. Yeah.
I've seen certain websites use
Mm-hmm.
like different layouts for different languages.
Mm-hmm. There's
Is
some
that-
truth to
is
that.
that a
Yeah,
thing?
that happens sometimes too.
Okay.
Yeah, especially with right-to-left languages, namely Hebrew and Arabic. Oftentimes, you'll flip it all the way backwards. You'll flip it, and the layout, what normally would be on the right is on the left. What's normally on the left is on the right. So some people do that. And in fact, if you do like Flexbox, Flexbox has this kind of idea of start and end. It automatically can flip. So it can automatically flip in those cases too.
For instances like that, where you have to like redesign it for a language that's split differently,
Yeah.
is there really going to be an instance where like we would do that in the field, or will they probably have someone that like speaks the language?
There's a there's a very high likelihood that you might need to do that. Yes, you're going to be, if you're trying to get something into Hebrew, you're going to need a translator to get the actual text in there. But your translator is not going to help you with making layout changes. Like you as a developer have access to the code. The translators shouldn't have any direct access to your code. Typically working with translators, you're going to be just sending spreadsheets back and forth. It's actually usually how that occurs. Is like, here's a spreadsheet, fill it in, they send you a spreadsheet back and you put that back in. They usually don't have any direct access to the code, okay? In our case, we did have to send out screenshots. So we'd send out screenshots of here's what all the screens look like before in English. And then when they got the translation back in, we also had to send them back. Here's what it looks like after it's been translated so that they could double check it and verify that it's been translated correctly. So there's a lot of back and forth there, but the thing to understand is they're not using your code or running your application typically. So that there's kind of a communication barrier that you have to deal with anyway. Okay, but that does mean that a lot of this work we have to do as developers, and we have to plan for, because it tends to affect every activity we write and every view model we write. It may not affect necessarily your data classes and your repositories. You try to kind of keep those agnostic. But anything that appears or is rendering data, presenting data to the user, is going to have to deal with these issues. Okay, that even includes the adapters as well. Cool. So part of it is reaching a larger market. There are other cases where you may need to do it for legal reasons. And such. The case that I was specifically working was in healthcare, and so they were filling out surveys themselves, and for the surveys really to hold water, they needed to be in the patient's language. Otherwise, how do you know that they really even answered the question? How do you on top of that check that they comprehended the English if their native language isn't English? So there's additional reasons, depending on what industry you're in, why you might need to do that, right?
I just wanted to give like an example. I remember reading something that, like in Quebec, Canada,
Yeah.
like the official language is French.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw something where like an Italian restaurant got like a fine or something because their menu, they had like the menu has to be completely in French.
Oh.
They use like an Italian word to describe one of their dishes, and they got fined for it or something.
That's not a story I've heard.
But, yeah.
But wow, yeah.
KFC isn't called KFC in Quebec for the same reason.
Yeah. So, I mean, in our case, if you're just strictly talking America, you're really usually just talking English and Spanish as kind of the two primaries. But yeah, I mean, you've got a bunch of issues that you have to deal with going internationally. There's a big company in town called Boeing. I mean, I'm sure they at some point have to translate their stuff into other languages, for all of their international work, as well as, just other companies that are here locally. So that's a thing to understand. The other thing to understand is just, in general, business is a lot more global than it used to be. It used to be that is pretty normal for most businesses to strictly operate in the U.S., but a lot of businesses, especially the businesses that are hiring IT workers, tend to have a lot more international user base and as well as a lot more international employees than maybe the general public. So it's a special interest to us. Okay. One question asked is, what part should you localize? And the answer is typically all of it. There are different mechanisms depending on what you're trying to localize. So for instance, for most things, we're going to use some APIs within that are kind of Android specific to translate most of the strings. But if you have data coming from other servers, such as let's say you have a REST API like eBay that you're connecting to, or whatever your homegrown REST API is, you may have to do some additional work on there, both on the back end and the front end, to provide and be able to have things that are internationalized, right? And so sometimes that means sending a language code when you actually make the request. Sometimes that means putting additional translations in the database. So let's say you need to have a name. Well, maybe you need to have that name in 20 languages in the database instead of just one. Or dealing with things like, hey, I want to do a case-insensitive search. Well, you have to be careful with other languages because things like 2 uppercase and 2 lowercase have a bit of nuances with a variety of languages. So those are things we kind of want to avoid, is ever calling 2 uppercase and 2 lowercase if it might be anything other than English. Those are safe in English, not safe in almost every other language, including German. Even German, that breaks for. So those are things you have to watch out for. When it comes to similar database side, there may be some additional strings you have to add in there and support. You may have to figure out, how do I structure and store that data? You also have, both for databases and servers, well, things can fail. What do you show when those things go wrong, right? How do you deal with those error messages? So that's usually not, your error message are usually contained in your code. They're not usually contained in the database. So those are things you have to figure out. Okay, do I translate it, for instance, on the client side, or do I translate it on the server side, right? Because usually the server side is generating an error message, or the client side may generate an error message, right? And things to watch out for, right? Let's say we didn't talk too much about internationalization in third semester, but it is an issue. It is something that factors into web development. But let's say the server's just sending, here's the string back, the error message. Well, then that's very hard to figure out how to translate, because you would have to know the error message ahead of time effectively, right? So a lot of times what we might do on the back end too with servers is we might send some sort of code or some sort of identifier plus the string, and then based on that number, I can translate the error back in. Or I might send to the server, hey, here, I want my results in Spanish, and so therefore when it gives me back errors, maybe it will give me back my error messages in Spanish and translate it on that end. You kind of have both ways to solve it, okay? So what we're primarily focused on is the client side, the Android side of things. But I do want to maybe touch on, if we have time, how to do some of the server side stuff as well. Okay? So, first question you want to ask is, okay, we want to go ahead and translate or change the language in the Android device. Actually, I need to do before that. I do want to show a video because it's a really good summary of some of the issues that we're going to run into, and then we can kind of talk about how to fix this. So, before I get into my next part, I do want to watch this video. I'm just going to throw this up on the big screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some notes over here on the right as far as what some of the problems are. So we can talk about, how can we fix those in Android. Because most of these things that he's going to talk about have a variety of fixes.